Good morning to all. Welcome. Welcome to people who are here for the first time or relatively new. Especially for you, should let you know what might unfold today in case you just showed up and aren't aware of what's in store. Today is the first Sunday in December, so we'll be doing what we call the all-day sit, though that deserves an asterisk because it never goes beyond 4 o'clock in the afternoon. But we'll have some sessions in the morning and a couple of sessions with some discussion after lunch. And today's focus, first of all, the first session is always some kind of calm abiding. So you can just sort of rest assured we generally start there. But today's focus for the day will be the practice of chenrezig, the practice of the bodhisattva. And that's a different style of practice than the calm abiding practice, and I'll go into that. Today I will have a particular focus in mind, both with the calm abiding and with the chenrezig practice. And I'm going to start with the calm abiding practices that are known collectively as the 4 foundations of mindfulness. Since there's a way that they, by bringing our attention to our kind of different aspects of our, what we would maybe call our ordinary experience, they provide a bridge to understand and a door perhaps into the practice of chenrezig. So without getting too far into it, that's just the general outline, but this first session will focus on the 4 foundations. But by way of general introduction, before we settle into our taking refuge, there is a way in which, no matter what style of practice, we're always looking at ways to get at the root of suffering and go beyond the root of suffering, the causes of suffering. And so no matter what it is, it goes along those lines. And since we don't look very carefully at our experience, think about suffering and the causes of suffering. One thing that came to mind this morning was thinking about when I was a kid. I went to my mother and I was doing something like this, and I said, "When I do this, it hurts." And she said, "Well, then stop." And you could say all our suffering really could be summed up into the instruction to just, well, stop when you're doing things that cause suffering. But if it was just so easy as knowing that if you twist your wrist backwards, it's not how it's designed to work. If it was that simple, we would have all done it. But in the midst of this, it goes from the coarse causes of suffering down to very subtle things. And in the not recognizing, getting down to basically not recognizing how it is that experience arises, not recognizing the nature of awareness, not seeing how this whole show works, not seeing how it is that when I wind up doing this over and over again. Trungpa Rinpoche is kind of great for a turn of phrase every once in a while. And he talks about this process going from this kind of this basic distortion which produces a kind of anxiety or a sense of something missing, something not quite right. And he has a whole chapter that I think if you gave it to George Carlin, everybody in the world would be Buddhist. just the way that he goes into it. But the little summary quote at the beginning of the chapter talks about this, and he's gone through all these things about how it is that we just keep on getting in our own way. He says, instead of just having our own anxiety, we produce a further state of anxiety in others. We generate their anxiety, and they also generate it themselves. And we wind up with what is known as the vicious cycle of samsara. Everybody is constantly making everybody else feel bad. We have been participating in this tremendous project, this constant mishap, this terribly bad mistake for a long time, and we are still doing it. So this is a nice touch of hyperbole in this, but there is something really quite true. And there are, within our tradition, there are two very generally different approaches to how we would deal with this. One, it's the technical term is the causal vehicle, which is kind of easy to understand once you see how do we put the causes in place for discovering what we're doing to cause ourselves suffering, and how do we put the causes in place for generating those different patterns of activity and different levels of understanding so that we might cease engaging in those causes and actually engage in the causes that lead us towards well-being and lead others towards well-being. So in that process, we do something that's sort of kind of an incremental deconstruction of the things that we're doing that cause problems, and an incremental replacement of those things that cause problems with things that cause well-being. The other approach is the approach that we'll focus on later, and that's the approach of becoming familiar with some hints from masters of the lineage and the Buddhas, some hints about what it would be like if we, how it would look, how we might act if we we weren't caught up at this very basic level of anxiety and distortion. What would we do? How would it be? So the fruition vehicle has to do with becoming familiar or familiarizing ourselves with what it would be like from the kind of the end of the path perspective. So this is just a kind of a general outline for the two things that we'll be threading together, the 4 foundations of mindfulness and the chenrezig practice. But when we go for refuge, we're making a fundamental, this is what we do at the beginning of all practice. It's the first step, whether we're engaged in either the causal vehicle or the fruition vehicle. It's the first step in any practice, is to turn our attention towards what is truly dependable. Placing in the center of our mind, the center of our attention, the example of the Buddhas, the example of teachings in the Dharma, the various instructions that provide ways out of this confusion, the example of others, the Sangha, our colleagues on the path, our colleagues in this effort to uproot confusion. We turn our attention in this direction and remind ourselves that we're not alone in this, and that just as we are also hoping that we we'll cease doing things that cause ourselves and others trouble, and to find profound well-being, so others are also in this same situation. So in this we generate a kind of clear sense of orientation and clarity of purpose. And so whatever spot we're in, wherever we are personally in this moment, today, right now, thinking about how it is that we'll let go, we wish to let go of those things that are not so reliable, and turn our attention towards what is, in the long run, deeply reliable, the source of our deep well-being.
Until the summit of enlightenment is reached, I and all beings go for refuge to the sources of true refuge. I will now practice the absorption of calm abiding in order to release all beings from their particular suffering and establish them in lasting peace and happiness. Until the summit of enlightenment is reached, I and all beings go for refuge to the sources of true refuge. I will now practice the absorption of calm abiding in order to release all beings from their particular suffering and establish them in lasting peace and happiness. Until the summit of enlightenment is reached, I and all beings go for refuge to the sources of true refuge. I will now practice the absorption of calm abiding in order to release all beings from their particular suffering and establish them in lasting peace and happiness.
In our ordinary life, when we wish to address any kind of problem or complicated situation, it's always helpful to look carefully at the conditions, circumstances, kind of ingredients of the situation. To look at it, at the situation, so that we see how it is that we're gathering our information. Check to see how it is that we're relating to the information, to the situation. The four foundations of mindfulness: mindfulness of the body, mindfulness of feelings, mindfulness of the domain of the mind and mental activity, and mindfulness of the dynamic play of phenomena. These practices allow us the opportunity to step back from the assumptions and the speed and momentum that we're usually engaged in our lives, and look carefully at how it is that we really are. What's actually going on? And we're starting with the basic raw ingredients of how it is that we contact the world through our body and our senses, how it is that we react to the world, the feelings of pleasant and unpleasant, how it is that we create understanding, hold stories, develop memories, that's in the domain of the mind and mental activity. And in mindfulness of phenomena, there's an opportunity just to watch the whole dynamic play unfolding. So we don't have time to go through this in great detail, but sometimes that's an opportunity to do something more simple. Just get a little flavor of this. Within the realm of mindfulness of the body, we have all the senses, all the physical senses. And very often, we're just lightly touching on what comes in through the various senses without even really noticing how this happens. Not really becoming aware. So we can begin just by letting the awareness move through the domain of tactile sensation. We usually pay attention only to those things where there's something either pleasant or unpleasant. We may not pay attention at all if we're wrapped up in thoughts and feelings and memories. But this is an opportunity just to let the mind scan through, and we'll do it, just spend a few minutes on this. So don't go too slowly. It's good to go through. Before we go to the next domain, if you go through it all the way, just go through it again. So perhaps starting with the head and moving through the torso and the arms and the hips and the legs and feet, and just allow the mind to scan through and meet the sensations in each area of this place that we call our body. While scanning through, labels might emerge in our mind, like hand or face. Just attend to the sensation. We may also have experiences of feelings of pleasant or unpleasant. And stories that might emerge from that. In this case, we're just attending to the sensation itself. Next, turn the attention to the domain of the experience of hearing things. Again, labels or feeling tones may arise in relationship to these audio sensations. Just turn your attention to the sensation of the sound, the experience of the sound itself. Next, turn your attention to the domain of sight. And here we very quickly get drawn into naming objects. There's no need to fight with that, but just turn your attention instead to just, this is the field of visual input, the field of colors and shapes, light and dark. It can help to hold a kind of panoramic sense of all that arises in this visual domain. Just to appreciate. This is seeing. If we have time, when we're doing this on our own, and there is something, the smell of cooking, or a flower, any kind of, anything in the domain of smell, the sense of smell, we can turn our attention to that. And the same with taste. even within the domain of mindfulness of the body, there are the different aspects of experience, sense experiences. And it can be helpful just noticing that these are all sense fields. And the sense of a continuous reality that we experience, where we see something, that thing makes a sound. Something moves and we see something move and it touches us. There's a sensation. There's nothing particularly wrong with the synthetic story that comes up, but it can lead us away from just being present with the basic fact that there are all these sense fields. So take a short break to stretch for a moment. You can feel all the tactile sensations involved in that. You can note the sense of why something feels like it needs to stretch or move. Perhaps the story that my legs always get stiff at this point. All these things being separate things. And turning attention again, bringing some clarity and vividness. Now we'll turn our attention kind of briefly to the domain of feelings of pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. Perhaps using the field of tactile sensation. Our attention may be quickly drawn to one place or another. But usually drawn to places where there's something either particularly pleasant or somewhat unpleasant. Just for a moment, notice the feeling tone. If we scan through the sensations of the body, it may take some effort to allow our attention to settle where there's a sense of neutrality about the experience. We might take for granted places where there's a relative sense of ease. The actual feeling tones of pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral, those feeling tones are often fleeting impressions. They spark all kinds of mental activity, all kinds of activity in the domain of the mind and mental events. And we may not feel engaged with things that are neither pleasant or unpleasant. Things that we end up thinking of, I like this or I don't like this. So it's worthwhile being able to place the attention on just the feeling tones of pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. Turning attention to the domain of the mind and mental events, mental activity. It's the play of all kinds of thoughts. Just noticing, thinking. Even if for the moment we have to invent a thought, just to give us something to attend to. Yes, this really is a thought. I am thinking. This is also the domain of mental imagery. Can bring to mind just some instant of arriving here this morning, some mental image. It's also the play of emotion, which from the Buddhist perspective is just another variety of mental activity. There may be moments, little gaps in mental activity. Space of stillness in mental activity. This is also the domain of the mind. And in some ways, similar to the way we relate to the domain of the body, where sight and sound and tactile sensation become interwoven. So also in the domain of the mind, memory, mental images, emotions, stories, they all play together. And when we're lost in the momentum of those, it's hard to notice. Just what's actually going on. In all of these practices, a key element in the cultivation is the ability to be able to let the awareness touch whatever it is that we're attending to, without being lost in the momentum of stories, and so forth. And the fourth of the four foundations is it's called mindfulness of phenomena, but you could call it just watching the whole ball of wax in operation. But it requires the same ability to be able to just touch with the awareness what's going on without being lost in it. But in this case, instead of consciously intending to observe some aspect of experience, we're just watching how the awareness moves from one kind of experience to another. We're just watching the way things move without any sense of controlling it or desiring it to turn out one way or another. A key piece in this is being able to relax with the movement of attention moment by moment. So just for a few moments, we'll just allow the attention to open and just watch, just feel what arises in the stream of experience. Just meet it moment by moment, without any idea that one thing is good or another thing is bad. Just relax with it, moment by moment. Finally, for just a moment, turn the awareness back on itself. Just feel the sense of being aware. Then we'll dedicate with the intention that whatever we have done will be a benefit not only for ourselves, but also for all beings.
By this virtue may I quickly realize Mahamudra and establish all beings without exception in this state.
Thank you all. Now we'll take a modest break here. We'll do this in silence, as is our habit on first Sundays. There's things to make tea with downstairs. There are restrooms upstairs and downstairs. And we can enjoy our silent companionship. And be back when Melinda rings the bell for us in 15 minutes or so, something like that. That's it. And if we could pass out the chenrezig texts for the next session, for those who are staying.